Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researchers Celebrities. Today we have Dr. Robert Friedman with us. We call him Bob also. That's how he liked to go with. A brief about his educational background. Bob has done bachelor's in natural sciences from Johns Hopkins, United States, and then he did PhD in ecological system analysis from University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has served in various institutions and started his career. And recently, he's retired from the John Craig Venter Institute as a vice president for public policies and still working with them. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Robert Friedman at the platform. Thank you very much for taking time out for Researcher Celebrities.
My pleasure.
So the
Thanks for having
conversation,
me.
yes, it is a pleasure to have you. The conversation here, how we goes is like how and when you decided that you wanted to be a researcher.
I guess I never decided that I wanted to be a researcher. So it's I knew very early on that I was interested in science.
Mhm.
Wanted to pursue a career in science in some way, but never really knew exactly what that meant. I would have been delighted to, follow the 18th century citizen scientist model, but of course, that's no way to put bread on the table. So I, as an undergraduate, actually decided to take a natural sciences degree only in my senior year. I had taken credits equally balanced in social sciences, quantitative sciences, natural sciences, and then late in my undergraduate education, just decided, well, I need to decide on something. I want to go to graduate school, chose natural sciences, and then went on from there.
So when you said that you never thought or decided that you wanted to be a researcher, after the bachelor's, there were so many opportunities. You could have done anything. Still, you went for a PhD. What was that story?
So I entered graduate school really more with an interest in environmental sciences. So whether I was going to be a practicing environmental engineer or an ecologist, as I ended up, I wasn't really sure what path that I was going to take. And I think throughout my career, I've wanted to I've always been attracted to accomplishing things on the ground, wanting to solve problems, not just research problems, but help to solve societal problems. So that's always been the tension throughout my career. Those skills that one learns as a researcher or training to be a researcher can apply to working in public policy, working on the ground engineering, directly solving problems, and so on. So even in graduate school, I kind of flip-flopped. When I did get my PhD, I very briefly took an academic job, which would have been much more traditional research career that would have been at the University of Florida in Gainesville. But I actually never showed up, and instead asked whether I could defer my arrival and spend a year as a congressional fellow working for the US Congress, again, postponing my academic career for the opportunity to hands-on work working with US Congress.
So this decision, when you were thinking or considering, once at one place you had your academic career waiting for you, welcoming you, and the second, when you are working for the government, which one as a researcher you were more inclined to?
Um, uh, which was I more inclined to do? I in my head, and I think much of that has to do with the sort of academic brainwashing that one goes through when you're in graduate school. In my head, I think I wanted to be an academic. I think probably in my heart, I wanted to get my hands dirty, to actually participate in, again, either the bump and shove of politics or actually working. And I actually took that first job working for Congress almost on a dare, where one of my one of the faculty members who I came to confide in and work with got tired of my sort of complaining about oh, those know-nothing folks in Congress and those politicians are doing things incorrectly, and basically told me to put up or shut up and to get out of academia and to actually participate. And it was that challenge, that dare, that set me on this other path. So again, it was that sort of tension of really loving to do the just science, curiosity-driven science, but as well wanting to accomplish, do real-world good works for the environment.
Absolutely. And speaking of dares, all the PhDs, just before, when any student who's ready to commit for a PhD, that itself is a dare. And then you succeeded that. Now it was you want to do academic research, or as you said in your words, going to like put some dirt on your hands. So there are administrators which we have the conversation at Researcher Celebrity. They give a view or their perspective, how they have enjoyed their training of PhD into the administration part. How was it with you when you were working with Congress?
Enjoy is not the word I would actually use. It's working in a heavily politicized environment. One might enjoy the struggle, the again the bump and shove of politics. But it is a very strange world for a scientist to participate actively. but it was very gratifying. So if you'll allow me to rather than focusing on the enjoyment part, on the sense of gratification of actually participating, getting things done, trying to get at least some semblance of science into important pieces of legislation, air quality legislation, water quality, bio, early days of biotechnology regulation, and so on.
So this brings us to the biotechnology part, as you mentioned, that in the early stages of biotechnology. So you have seen the technology in biology when this entire field started, from there to present, when where you have written so many books and publications on policies using science, technology, and biotechnology. If you can share that how this journey from an academic researcher to the politics, and then ending up the person who's responsible for so many policy formations.
Yeah, so it was an interesting journey, coming into an organization, when I started working for Congress rather than working for an individual member. I was working in a organization that was devoted to science and technology policy advising to the committees of the Congress. So it was, our agency was required to, of course, work for both parties, both the House and the Senate in the United States, to be the sort of neutral arbiter. But about half of the agency was science-based. The rest were political scientists, sociologists, economists, so on and so forth. So it's even in that neutral environment, it was working in a intensely interdisciplinary approach, many different colleagues. And then when working with committee staffers and so on, the number of scientists who actually participate, who as committee staff and so on, now we're talking about not just 50%, but dropping down to on the order of 5%, maybe 10% of the committee staff having some scientific training. So it was that sort of a struggle to first to go from a traditional scientific training to and perhaps because of my field, environmental science, more interdisciplinary than most, to have to work in a truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary fashion within our policy research organization. And then the next step, work with committee staff, actually trying to craft and then draft legislation, craft policy and draft legislation, where science was just the tiniest component. So it was making that transition, that new sort of experience, was quite quite a challenge, and really very gratifying, very interesting. You're always learning new ways of thinking about things, um, broadening your perspectives on challenges within society and how those challenges are actually dealt with.
Nice. So here we'll talk about your involvement. So you started as a scientist working for, as you said, crafting policies and drafting legislature. Starting from that, and now when you served as a full-time policymaker, like, where you are doing that part heavily, and now there are other scientists who are reporting or helping drafting the documents, that how this the researcher in you has evolved from academic hardcore researcher to then to a policymaker administrator, and then at the position where you just say that, okay, I think for the public it is more important at this point of time, it's not the science part, but it is the policy, or the public part. How that, if you can explain.
I'm not sure I quite understood your question.
Okay, so
phrase it again. And
yeah, so let me rephrase it. When you started, a scientist going to policy making and trying to understand all the policy where science is, not very important for them. But when you reached that level where now you are the one who's asking for the drafts and looking into it so that you can make corrections in legislature and making the policies in there. So now here, the evolution of a researcher. At starting, science was the integral part you wanted, but later on, you're like, in recent roles of yours, you are more about what will be good for public, but not as science as such.
yes, um, uh, yes, the focus is on society, and I guess again, it is. When one really, what's the right word, accepts that as scientists, we have a certain way of thinking, a certain way of viewing the world, and we often set our priorities accordingly. When we do that, we don't always understand or even think about other aspects of society, the way other people think, and that's being able to think more broadly, to just put yourself in other people's shoes and other people's way of thinking is extremely important when thinking about what new technologies might we want to work on. What attributes should those technologies have to fit in comfortably with the way our local communities or society actually work. It's incorporating that sort of larger worldview becomes whatever second nature. It becomes just part of your personality, and important that scientists actually, if they don't explicitly incorporate those perspectives, at least understand those perspectives and be able to think those through when they're doing their work, when they're, again, developing new technologies, new inventions that they hope will make their way into society.
Nice. So here I would like to tell all the viewers and audience in here, coming from Bob directly, that all the researchers, enthusiasts, now with the pace the technology is changing, we have so many things in our head, the way we want to do, but always try to incorporate and broaden your horizon as much as you can so that you can think of a bigger picture for society. Expect like keeping your experiments obviously integral, but this is something which I believe these days the scientists are more aware of, and we need not to educate them about that, but this is something which everyone should keep in their mind all the time. Doesn't matter at what stage of career of your research you are. You, if you are a PhD student coming up with brilliant ideas, you still have to think outside the box and think about the society, how the work can be translational, and what should be the limitations for the rest of the public also. So, Bob, coming back to you here about the coexistence, let's talk about the coexistence of a researcher with a policymaker. Because we have heard administrator parts in there where they are not making policies, but just scientists doing the job about, okay, we need an equipment, which is an expensive one. So they just check all the parameters what they initially want in there, and that is part of their administrative duties. But with you we got this freedom where you actually did walk that path. So how this coexistence works?
Um, uh, I'll take a step back. You used the phrase, Raja, thinking outside the box.
Yeah. Yes.
I would say it's thinking inside the box.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Because the box is much broader.
True.
And I think that same sort of answer applies to coexistence.
Mm-hmm.
It's recognizing that the boundaries incorporate all those other perspectives, and especially for young researchers, and I don't use that term brainwashing in a pejorative sense, but when one so intently focuses on science and science alone and academia, and I want to be a professor at a great university, that it seems like that's the whole world, but that's a really tiny part of the world, and it's very important to take off those blinders to really see that world out there is much broader, and that notion of coexistence, that's reality, not the other part. Is but I'll put a period there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so now here you just brought up a very interesting point, which normally we struggle to have this conversation with our researcher celebrities. So now you mentioned about the race in research. People, this cutthroat competition, either it is about publication, getting grants, or just focusing so much that they don't think anything outside the experiments or the success of grants or something like that. How you have seen the field changing in couple of decades ago? So now 2 decades ago it was not the way how grants were submitting, or either for PhD registrations. Things has changed a lot. So if you can share before and like what were the pros and cons what we are running to in.
Um, So, at least during my career, it's almost been cyclical as to um, whether whether strictly curiosity-driven science will be the approach, or whether one has to put your science in a larger societal perspective. When I was in graduate school in those ancient days, paleo-ecological days, the National Science Foundation had a program called Research Applied to the National Need, which went on for several years and then became less popular. And the notion of your research having to be societally relevant and those sorts of justifications required as part of a grant application, that kind of disappeared. And now we're beginning to see that again. A little bit in the United States, much more strongly in Europe, where research applications have to include that larger societal component. So so over a span of 20 years, it looks like this has been just increasing. But I think it's actually more cyclical within our society, and I think for the better, we're in that part of that cycle where it really is necessary to think about and justify why it is that you're doing the research that you're doing. If you're using public funds, you have a responsibility to the public, and for a long time that was something that was not accepted or a perspective that was not thought very highly of by at least some in the scientific community. But I think we're seeing today more and more young scientists really thinking about that and wanting to incorporate that into the research that they're pursuing.
So this brings us to a very interesting topic. What are your thoughts about the differences between fundamental research and translational research?
Yeah. So within some fields, when I was an undergraduate, very early on, I was thinking about astrophysics as a major. Then moved to planetary physics, and then eventually moved into, well, maybe the planet that I should be interested in is Earth rather than others in our solar system. So clearly science, just to understand how the universe works, very fundamental research is very important. And this may sound like I'm contradicting what I just said before about research applied to the national need and so on. There, I certainly support that there needs to be a healthy component of our research that is curiosity driven, that is really just understanding our world. And the societal benefits there are much more, understanding who we are and why we're on this planet and so on and so forth. That said, again, when one is dealing with public dollars and some percentage of that, some very large percentage of that, needs to focus on societal needs. And again, it is really that striking the right balance for the time, given the extent of our societal needs today. Perhaps that pushes the balance a little further to the edge of needing more along those lines.
And as you said, curiosity is the soul for any research, and balancing the fundamental with the translational research is something which we believe is the world working towards too. So talking of the research and the pressure which it comes with, what are your suggestions or your experiences that when things don't go the way a researcher want, the stress, be it the grants for the PIs when it doesn't go through, as a graduate student when the paper get rejected, or just simply the experiment doesn't work the way they want, what are your suggestions and experiences if you would like to share?
Oh boy. When things don't work, my career has been so non-traditional. Much of my research funding was rather than government grants, from private foundations. So when the notion of the research not working is perhaps an odd construct. The research works, but perhaps the findings are negative, or the findings don't meet the hypothesis that one began with. So so much of my own career has not focused on traditional hypothesis-driven research, but much more of a discovery-driven approach. And that may sound odd for someone who's done mostly public policy, but I think when one goes in, with that sort of problem-solving perspective, then some of that formalism of science doesn't quite translate, and that one follows an entirely different approach. Yeah. If your question, Raja, is how do you deal with quote failures, expectation, not meeting your original expectation? I, I I think it's what was your expectation? Was your expectation again to help, to guide others through a decision-making process? Um, uh, uh, there's so many ways of defining success that I'm not sure that one needs to spend a lot of time focusing on how do I deal with failures. It's just focus on the successes. We may be just talking past each other at this time, but anyway.
But this is, I think, the great way to all the audience. I would like to specially mention what just Bob just mentioned. This is the greatness of all the researchers. Thomas Alva Edison, when people asked him that, okay, your experiments failed so many of them. He said that, okay, I told what you cannot use for the bulb filament. And that's exactly how Bob said, instead of focusing what failed, it is the perspective, the state of mind you are in. If you're enjoying your research, for you, it is just an outcome of your experiment, which might or might not aligning with the hypothesis, which Bob also mentioned in here. So in research, never, so there is this saying that never marry an idea. So you can always, because that's how we start the research, always coming up with a hypothesis, but always give this freedom that that might not go the way you want it. And there are so many discoveries which came out of that because people were open for accepting all the outcomes, possible outcomes, because they said, okay, we want to do this, and now we want to see how this thing show up. So all the young researchers and researchers at any stage, the words from Bob should be motivating for you, that if something is not going the way you want, you still should be happy about it and look just the way Bob just mentioned. Start focusing more on the success and converting all the failures into your success, just by saying that, okay, this thing doesn't work because of this reason. Now, when we are walking to the edge of the conversation, Bob, I would like to ask the word of wisdom you would like to share with our young researchers, mostly when either they are just considering that they should pursue a PhD, or they should take a research position, or they should just do some other jobs, but quitting on research.
Um, yeah. So, yeah. My earphone just dropped out, but follow your passion. It's the only reason to do research is if you really enjoy that search for the unknown, and you can do that in traditional science. You can do that in many other fields. If it's and one can use that science education as a preparation for many other career opportunities. It's sort of learning a way of thinking about the world. And as you heard me say before, there are many different ways of thinking about the world, but ground yourself deeply in one particular way. Science is a very good way. Research science is a very good way, knowing later or hoping later that you will broaden out and incorporate those other perspectives. But I think it is, don't just focus on the traditional definition of research as a career. You may choose that path, but the skills that you learn and the science that you learn will be applicable in many other areas. So that would be the first part of the advice. If you allow me to pick up on another thread, when we were talking about applied basic versus applied research or translational, etc. There's another way to think about that, and it's worth exploring, the notion of Pasteur's quadrant, which, rather than thinking about research as a single spectrum from basic to applied, looks at it as a matrix, and in each of those, there's a way to do research focusing on specific outcomes, and some of those specific outcomes may have societal advantages. Some may be just completely curiosity driven. But the sweet spot was like Pasteur's sweet spot of curiosity-driven research that led to and was driven by important societal needs. So thinking about, again, that notion when you're going through your career, or when you're preparing for your career, of how do you get yourself into that sweet spot that satisfies both of those needs, your wish to satisfy your sense of scientific curiosity and your wish to accomplish positive things for society.
Absolutely. I think this is nicely summarized, and for all the researchers, Bob just mentioned that follow your passion and enjoy the journey. With the words, we would like to say thanks to Bob, a huge thanks to take out this time, because we understand once you're retired, you are more busy because you have so many duties, and you are one of them who probably are more involved and more busy now. So thank you very much for taking time out and sharing the thoughts and views, and for motivating our researchers. Thank you very much, Bob.
You're quite welcome.